Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We are live to discuss, was Ayn Rand wrong about a woman president? So we've done a few events about some of Rand's controversial statements that were on topics that weren't, strict philosophy and were in the previous two examples of Native Americans and homosexuality were brief comments, at least the public comments that she made. In this case, we're discussing a topic that she actually wrote a short essay on, which you can find in The Voice of Reason. So this is a topic on which she had a much clearer, I think, much more well thought out view. But I'm not sure how much of her view here is actually the title of the essay and the event, and how much of it is more an issue of female psychology, as I understand the essay. But we have people who will explain to us her views and whether or not they agree with them. And first, let me present the moderator for tonight's event, Gloria Alvarez.
Thank you, Razi. It's a pleasure being here to discuss this important topic, especially given the current events about the leadership of one of the most important nations in the planet, the United States, that was one of Ayn Rand's inspiration, especially the way which it was formed. And for today's discussion, I want to thank everybody that is joining us through the different platforms. YouTube, we're also sharing this on Twitter and Facebook, and to discuss if Ayn Rand was wrong or right, or what exactly were her views about a woman president. Today is joining us Professor Harry Binswanger. He is a member of the Ayn Rand Institute, and he has written a lot of books regarding Ayn Rand's her philosophy. And of course, we've also been participating in the introduction to Objectivism courses that are also available in the Ayn Rand Institute. And also James Valliant, who is joining us again. Thank you, James, for being here. And the way that we're gonna do this is, first we're gonna have Harry giving us a scope of what was Ayn Rand's views. Then we will have James, a little bit of interaction in between the two. Mind you, if you have questions, you can use the super chat to send you your questions. And also, well, thank you for everybody for being here. So let's start with Harry and thinking a little bit about what were Ayn Rand's views about a woman president, if there was a...
Okay. I think you have to break this issue down into three parts. The first part, as the outline for what needs to be discussed, and I won't discuss everything at once so that James and I can go back and forth a little bit. The first topic is fundamental in the article, and everyone who has an opinion on this topic should read the article. It's amazing how many people either do not read the article, which I'm holding up here, an answer to readers about a woman president, or read it once and don't study it. The first topic that comes up in this issue: is there such a thing as femininity? Which was not controversial when she wrote that, but is today with the, what do you call it, fluid gender roles. But her position very strongly, with which I agree, is that there are two psychosexual identities, masculine and feminine. And aside from a very small number of tragic cases of people born with some kind of physical problem of development of the sex organs, but they do exist, hermaphroditic individuals, or something goes wrong. For 99.999% of the population, the sexual identity comes from the way they process their physical, anatomical identity. So the first question is this valid? Is there such a thing as femininity and masculinity? But we're particularly interested in femininity here. Second question is, if so, what does it consist of? She says hero worship. Hero worship specifically for masculine qualities. Is that the right theory of femininity, if there is such a thing as femininity? And finally, if so, does being president go against the feminine psychology, the feminine desire to hero worship men? I think that all of those questions are popular attitudes on all those questions are quite different from what they were then. But it's not that she was wrong, it's that our culture is wrong. Of course, a big topic is going to be what is cultural and what is metaphysical. So we will have to get into that, but I want to take up each of those topics in order because it makes no sense to do the if so, when you don't agree with the first part. I'm not going to get into that yet, my answer to the first part, but there is Nathaniel Branden's answer, and he's speaking for her in The Objectivist, when he was an objectivist. There's no question but that this, it was lectured on, it's in print, she read it, she definitely agreed with it. But in the Objectivist of January 1968, Self-Esteem and Romantic Love, Part 2, he outlines the facts that they held, both of them, underlie a psychosexual identity of masculinity versus femininity. Now, of course, we have to say here what we said in the discussion of homosexuality. This is not part of objectivism. Psychological theories, particularly of this kind, are not part of objectivism. So the fact that, or the prospect of your disagreeing with this, any part or all of it, has nothing to do with whether you agree with the tenets of objectivism. Leonard Peikoff once asked Ayn Rand, what is the objectivist philosophy's content on sex? And she answered, according to him, as I recall it, that it's good. That much is part of objectivism, but what it consists of and what various desires come from and how a child develops is an issue for psychology, not for philosophy. However, you would dismiss her views on anything at your peril, because she didn't state public views on something that she hadn't thought through. And I think Razi said, or somebody said at the beginning, that she hadn't thought through. I think that was a slip of the tongue. Some of the other topics, like homosexuality, she had thought it through, but she hadn't written on it, and she hadn't crystallized it with that full luminous clarity, which is a thought named in words, to quote Dagny. So she didn't make casual statements or off-the-cuff statements. She thought about everything, and a formulation she might give in an unprepared moment might be not what she would endorse in the full context. But she was not your usual person in that regard. She was much better. Okay, so James, did you want to take over at this point, or
Well,
add in, or whatever?
I think you've identified correctly the essential issue here. It's not an issue for Ayn Rand of philosophy or ethics. She makes quite clear in the essay itself, she does not regard women to be intellectually or morally inferior or different than men, not in that respect. We're human beings. And I think it's also important to set context, to step back a little. The female characterizations, her attitude about women, I think is important to set some broader context. The heroines in her novels are not conventional housewives. They're not typical characters, especially in the time she was writing. Kira in We the Living, for example, wants to be an engineer who builds bridges. There's a wonderful scene in the Fountainhead where Dominique tries to talk Howard Rourke out of being an architect, and she tries to tempt him. We'll go away together. You'll do something insignificant. I'll cook and clean and tend house. And don't laugh. I could do it. As if the idea that Dominique would be a traditional housewife is a laughable idea even to her. And even more powerfully, in the very conservative era of the 1950s, the presentation of Dagny Taggart is absolutely stunning. It's wonderful how she portrays it. You meet Dagny Taggart. She, not any of the men surrounding her, runs Taggart Transcontinental. She has the brains, the determination, the virtue to actually run Taggart Transcontinental. Her competitive nature, right? Her determination, her intelligence is the match for any man other than a very elite group of heroes in Ayn Rand's view. In fact, at Dagny's debutante ball that her mother throws for her, she starts out with great hope, but by the end of the evening, when she meets most of the guys there, the comment she makes is wonderful. There's not a man here I couldn't squash 10 of. Now, she doesn't mean physically. She's just a slender woman and there's 10 guys, 10 young men. No. She means in terms of her determination, her brains, her virtue. She could squash 10. So it's not that Rand views women as needing to adhere to some traditional conservative religious role, being a housewife and being submissive to your husband. Not at all. Nor does Ayn Rand view women, in effect, as unable to do roles that were, at that time especially, traditionally men's roles. When she was a young woman, Dagny, we're told, it first occurred to her that women didn't run transcontinental railroads, but she dismissed that. She gave that thought no more thought. It didn't deserve it. To Ayn Rand's view, in other words, the idea that a woman would run a transcontinental railroad is not objectionable. A woman breaking, in fact, if you looked at Ayn Rand's comments before the mid-1960s, such as her Playboy interview where she was asked about the roles of women, she sure sounds like a feminist. Oh yeah, there's no particular work that's feminine, she says to Playboy magazine, and it's the same with women. Women should have careers just like men do, she says to Playboy magazine. Something changed. I do believe something changed. If you look at her pre-60s portraits of women in her novels, her comments before that, her the Objectivist newsletter positively reviewed early feminist Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. I don't think it was Ayn Rand that changed. I think it was feminism that changed. And feminism began to develop this unisexual, there's no difference at all between men and women. Women need men like fish need a bicycle, was one of the phrases of the new feminists. And that there was no difference between men and women at all. And that women could basically do without men. You've even got extreme feminists these days. I mean, just like with environmentalism in the 60s, Ayn Rand's X-ray vision could really see the nature of environmentalism as anti-mind, anti-life, and where it was going. I think the same is true with feminism. She could see the anti-man direction, the anti-sexual distinction, gender distinction direction that feminism was heading in, and she recoiled. And she recoiled from that aspect of modern feminism because she herself really didn't have a traditional view of the role of women. But she did very much object to this contemporary feminist idea that there are no differences between the sexes. And I think that's what we really need to understand, is that Ayn Rand, as she says in the article explicitly, it's not a question of any moral or intellectual difference. It's a purely psychological issue. And so I agree with Dr. Binswanger. Those understanding femininity and Ayn Rand's understanding of femininity, it really didn't change. I'd point you to a short story that Ayn Rand wrote early in her career called Good Copy. She tells that through her heroine in that short story, the hero in that short story, women are the bunk. Interesting comment. In other words, Ayn Rand's attitude was that women should be more like men. If there's going to be equality, the equality is that we shouldn't feminize men. We should, in effect, masculinize women to make them more interesting. And really, that's Ayn Rand didn't change. One of her last answers to a question in 1982 in her last speech, she was asked about feminism, and she just came down really hard. I am a male chauvinist proudly. And again, I think that's an assertion of her own values. She admired masculinity. She worshiped masculinity. She hungered for something. She was a strong woman like Dagny Taggart. She didn't think of herself as weak or women as weak. She thought that women, the nature of femininity, was to admire and worship even something stronger, right? It's not that she was weak. She wants to look up. She said she can't stand looking down. She could barely take looking across at an equal. What she longed for was to look up and admire. And for her, the nature of femininity, being a woman, is the desire to worship a man and masculinity.
Yeah, I second that. And it's really hard for us to appreciate how against the culture she was. I can vouch for it because I grew up in that culture, but there are no novels with women executives. I mean, now you can't make a movie unless the woman somewhere slugs a man in the face. But which I don't recommend, but back in the 50s, and when she wrote Atlas Shrugged, and into about 1964 with the Feminine Mystique, 63, I think, the women were held to be properly housewives, that was what they should be. And when she and Brandon, through the, echoing her, said, women are human beings too. They need careers just like everyone else does, and created a heroine of a woman who ran a railroad. It was almost slapping the face of the culture that she was in. It was certainly made you sit up and take notice. So that's, gone completely the other way, bad in the other way. So women are no longer slender reeds, blushing and staying in the home. But now they're Comrade Sonias, to take another one of her character. Now they're just like men. Well, that's fading. I mean, I think it's recognized that there are some differences. Despite the propaganda, I mean, you hear woke parents commiserating with each other. I did everything I could to, get Johnny to play with dolls and Susie to play with trucks, but they don't want to do it. It's like, they're 1 and 2, there's a preference there. Anyway, I'd like to now turn to, one other comment. In the letters of Ayn Rand, when she was, had just written The Fountainhead and there wasn't television and so forth, people didn't know her gender, and they would write fan letters, "Dear Mr. Rand." And she would reply, "I'm glad if you think I'm a man, but no, I'm a woman. I'm glad, my writing has masculine qualities, but no, I'm a woman."
And that reminds me of the compliment that Ludwig von Mises, the famous economist, once gave her. Henry Hazlitt referenced it once. You know, Lou said, "You're the bravest man in America, most courageous man in America," I think is the exact quote. She was delighted, apparently, at that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think she said, "Did he say man?"
Right.
with eagerness.
Right. She definitely wanted to be called a man.
Yeah. Because Mises knew her, so he knew she was a woman. And when he said, I think it wasn't a quote, "the only man left in America," something
I think
like
the most
that.
courageous man in America.
You think so?
If I recall
Okay.
correctly.
All right. Anyway, but it was, the 50s were an era of togetherness and something called momism, which you probably haven't heard of, but momism was the feminization of the culture and the man becoming feminized. Yeah, that's right, feminized. And that's going on again. But it was to be thought of as a man. It's like the same thing that she said when she wrote The Simplest Thing in the World, the short story about the writer Henry Dorn, who can't get published because he writes about heroes. And he says his previous novel, Triumph, had been praised by Laurette Flum. I mean, you have to, Laurette Flum. But for its love story, he didn't know there was a love story in his novel. So she was determined to be not thought of as a housewifey, conventional female type. She was very much in rebellion against that from childhood on. Anyway, what about, is there such a thing as femininity? Brandon, when he was still playing the role of an objectivist in January 1968, wrote this article in which he identified 3 things. And you should read this article if you want to know what her understanding was, because it's hers. The preface is, one's sexual identity is normally an integral and intimate part of one's experience of personal identity. No one experiences oneself merely as a human being, but always as a male human being or a female human being. The way, and ... the way one psychologically experiences one's maleness or femaleness, that he's talking about, the sexual identity is not in the anatomy, but the way one experiences the anatomy and its consequences. One's psychosexual identity, one's sexual personality, is the product and reflection of the manner in which one responds to one's nature as a sexual being. Now, the 3 facts of difference that make a difference that he refers to, and I'm just going to quote him. The difference in the male and female sex roles proceeds from differences in man's and woman's respective anatomy and physiology. Now, bear in mind, it's really how you process this difference, but the difference has to be there to be processed. 1, physically, man is the bigger and stronger of the 2 sexes. Did you know, I just heard that, do you remember the Billie Jean King and Bobby Rigg tennis match? It's now revealed that Bobby Rigg threw it. It's now a known conceded fact that he threw it because she beat him and everybody was so excited. Women are the equal men in tennis, but it's not true. They have to keep the leagues separate because there is such a big difference. The difference in the male and female sexual proceeds. Physically, man is the bigger and stronger of the 2 sexes. His system produces and uses more energy and he tends, for physiological reasons, to be physically more active. And I think parents do see this in children. 2, the numbers are mine. 2, sexually, his is the more active and dominant role. He has the greater measure of control over his own pleasure and that of his partner. And 3, it is he who penetrates and the woman who is penetrated, with everything this entails physically and psychologically. Now, that's the interesting part, I think, because without these other facts, you could just say, well, suppose Black men are on average stronger than white men. Certainly, there are tribes, of what is the Watusi, big, huge guys, and then they're pygmy tribes. So if you just said, well, one's physically stronger than the other, but they don't relate to each other the way men relate to women, it's because of the sexual side of things. The first is just a kind of setting up of things. And the way that was concretized at the time is that the sex act depends upon the man's wanting it. You can't have regular intercourse unless the man has an erection. In order for the man to have an erection, he has to be excited, aroused, wanted. Now, of course, that raises the question, well, what if you don't want to have normal, or you're willing not to have normal sexual relations? There are lots of other things that you can do in sex that do not require penetration or erection. But somehow, and I have a theory about that, it doesn't seem quite fair to bring everything down to, well, it's all really any kind of relating, physical relating is sex, and regular sexual intercourse, if we call coitus, is just one of very many things that are all equal. That doesn't sit well with me. I don't know if it sits well with you. It seems that the penetration part is the essential, and the others are adornments, if you will, accessories to that. They're good, and they're good, but they're not of the essence. Now, I would add to this, and it's interesting that it's not here, that women have babies, which would biologically seem to be a very big difference. Up until the time of the pill, this meant that women had to be a lot more reluctant to have sex and careful about who they had it with than men did. Because a woman's whole life, certainly for 20 years, could be subordinated to taking care of a child if she got pregnant. Now, with the pill, that has changed somewhat, but still the only way the human race is maintained is by sexual intercourse. Again, you could posit, well, what if in the brave new world that's coming, the few cases that there now are of artificial insemination become completely widespread? But that was not a consideration in the writing of this article or the development of the psychology we're talking about. So I don't think it's fair to bring that in yet. Maybe after we've got the basics down. In terms of penetration, I know a former objectivist who said, but motion is relative. So, the man is taking the woman, but the woman is enclosing the man, and isn't it all relative? But just, introspectively, it isn't. And this that's why this is not part of philosophy, because you can say, well, my introspection from my sexual experiences is it's not that way.
Well,
And there's
another
really no answer to that.
I could add to this fellow's objection by saying that a man can be penetrated even by a woman, not in the same way. That's why I find your potential for pregnancy actually an interesting. Not only is, let me put it this way, as you point out, the biologically productive aspect of sex, a woman being penetrated, but further being exposed to the risk of pregnancy and that vulnerability. And I do think that that surely has an effect. It's going to have an effect on psychology in terms of who's going to get pregnant. Is it the man who's going to carry the child and have to worry about necessarily? He could dump the woman if he's irresponsible, right? He could be an immoral, irresponsible guy and take off. She's the one who's going to be pregnant and stuck with a baby. So, so that potential does make the woman more vulnerable. Let's put it that way, to the basic act of sex, which is responsible for human reproduction. Yeah, I think that's significant.
I think that's a metaphysical fact. It is alterable by technology, if and we're taking the first steps in that direction with artificial insemination. But in principle, you could find other ways to perpetuate the race than sex. But who would want to? That'd be my question.
I think that Brandon made a point that you didn't focus on, but one about other physiological differences he put in there that tend to make a man more physically active in general. I think there he may be on to other physiological differences between men and women, which are also relevant. I believe that this approach is important because it cognitively explains the source of it. And as an objectivist, the one thing about psychology that is philosophical is that our emotions are rooted in our cognition. And the approach here is a good one in the sense that these are the basic facts that will lead to certain kinds of cognitions about understanding what sex is for me personally. But I think there may be other physiological differences. They do the classic experiment of toddlers, and it doesn't matter what culture they do it in. When you put 2 3-year-old and 5-year-old girls together, they play face to face. Any language, any culture. You put 3 and 5-year-old boys together, they play side to side, looking at the project. Now, that is a universal, and it's true of toddlers in different languages and cultures. I don't know what the basis for that is, but we also have now good physiological evidence that the brains of women and men are physiologically different.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. It is a scientific question, not a philosophic question. And it could involve physiological differences that also have will process cognitively in different ways. But in terms of, for example, a man needing to physically act out more, that we find true, for example, when you just give testosterone to chimpanzees. Don't give the testosterone, they're calm and social. You give the testosterone, they tend to physically act out more, pick up stuff, throw stuff, even get into fights with each other more. So yes, there are reasons why men, I think, are more physically active. It has to do maybe with metabolism and hormones and our brain, who knows, but it's a scientific question. And those kind of differences will have differences that will have to be cognitively processed by boys and girls. Yeah. And that will have an effect.
Yeah. And also the boys and girls see the way that the parents behave and all men and women behave in their environment. So they don't have to figure out the consequences or the causes, I should say, of the sex roles without exemplars around them. They have lots of those. It's not just what can the child perceive about another child, but what did they perceive about their parents?
Yes.
There were a lot of thought experiments that were suggested. One of the best was you have a bunch of men who are stranded on a desert island and are alone without women. And they become something less refined, let's say, than they would in civilization. They become more rough and ready. They don't become any less masculine. There wouldn't be any risk. Even if they turned to homosexuality, I think it would, I don't think they would, I don't know. I don't know what to say about it. This is what was said. It wasn't considered that they might turn to homosexuality. But the contrast is with a bunch of women stranded on the desert island who have to fend for themselves just the way the men do. There would be a problem of maintaining their femininity as they turn their attention solely to survival in the external world. And the conclusion that was drawn at that time and taught in lectures was masculinity is a relation to the world. Femininity is not. Femininity is a relation to men. So when there are no men, there's a risk.
I want to...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm at the end of that anyway.
Because we're discussing these physiological differences, and now we have way more on findings and studies that were available in the 1980s. One of the things that Harry was mentioning is that masculinity is a relation between men interaction with reality. And what we're finding out is that femininity is more a relation in between social dynamics. And this is an evolutionary process because of the roles that were given as men having to deal with hunting and gathering, whereas women were in charge of taking care of the kids, of the fire, and then like the social interaction was the norm. So tool in order to maintain social structures and relationships into knowing who you can trust and who you couldn't. So you can say that femininity is more about social interaction, masculinity is more about the interaction with the world per se. Now, in that sense, we have a super chat question from Shia Levy, and she asks,
no, that's he. That's Gloria, that's Shay. That's a man.
Shay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought...
Very appropriate for this topic.
Yes. Sorry, Shay. So he asks, could the prevalence of the pill and safe abortion change the rational attitudes? And what about artificial wombs?
You cut out there in a couple of words. Could the availability of what?
Birth control or artificial
could the prevalence of the pill birth control with the pill and safe abortion change the rational attitudes and also artificial womb?
I hope not, because there's what's gone from our culture is I suspect it's more lasting in South America, but in America what's gone is the romance of the male-female relationship. So yeah, I think you can, I think technology can compensate for the differences as it develops more and more. I don't know that it will ever replace the normal paths to procreation. But it'd be a shame if it wiped it out. It'd be a damn shame.
Let me describe it this way. My wife decided very early on in her life that she did not want to have children. So to her, the issue of pregnancy or artificial wombs, absolutely irrelevant. Nonetheless, the way I would describe my relationship with my wife is she likes to be really strong, competitive, aggressive, and she's all those things. She's a Dagny Taggart. And yet, the way I would put it is, I want her to be so strong she doesn't need someone to take care of her. But I want it to be so that when I'm around, she doesn't need to protect herself. Mm-hmm. Her own strength doesn't diminish the fact that when we're walking on the beach, she gets a special pleasure from leaning against me. And I get a special pleasure from her leaning against me. In that sense, I agree with Harry. It would be a shame to lose that, to lose the special joy that my wife, a woman who has decided never to reproduce, that's not the issue for her. The risk of pregnancy isn't the issue for her. The issue for her, like with Ayn Rand, is purely she wants to look up to someone who's even stronger than herself. She has self-esteem. She perceives herself as an intelligent, strong, capable woman who doesn't need a man, really. She just wants a man to look up to. And I get a special pleasure from her looking up to me and me being able to protect her. Doesn't mean she needs my protection. It's just I get a special pleasure from protecting her. And that's the best way I have of describing it.
Yeah. I'd like to mention some of the what I call manifestations of the sexual differences that your immediate reaction if you're under the age of 45, 50 is, oh no, that's cultural. So let that sound in your brain and then let it pass and think, is there a non-cultural aspect to this? Why is it that women make themselves up, but men don't? Why is it that women have long, soft hair, but men don't? Now, I know in earlier times when scissors weren't invented, men had, but they didn't have, soft, curvy hair like women do. Why is it that a woman wears dresses that emphasize the curviness and flowiness and elegance of their body, whereas men's clothing is boxy and not that way at all? Yeah, Scotsmen wear kilts, but they don't wear, slinky dresses. Why is it that men have always led on the dance floor? Why? Here's one that really will stop you because it's obviously not cultural. Most, and I guess it would be 80, 90%, probably 90% or more, most women marry men older than themselves. And most men marry women correspondingly younger than themselves. Why is that if they're equal? I say it's because a woman wants to look up to a man. She wants a man who is ahead of her in the progression of development. In general, there's a difference between a woman's desire to be chosen and a man's desire to have someone to choose. And the image is the man is out looking for the one to take, to grab, to get, to make his wife. The woman is hoping the right man will pick her. And now she can do a lot of things to make herself available. And
Ayn Rand tripped Frank O'Connor on the bus.
That's
to get to know
perfect. That's perfect.
Isn't that a good one?
Yeah, that's perfect. But what she didn't do is go up to him and say, hey, my name's Ayn, what's yours?
Right.
What's your sign?
So we have have a lot of follow-up in the chat about this, but first we have another super chat question from Jonathan Honing. And this is something that I asked Harry when we were doing the series. And also I asked Yaron Brook when he was here in Mexico City. And that is if Ayn Rand ever had any takes or opinions on Margaret Thatcher. In fact, the thing that they were at the same time living and knowing maybe the work of each other. What do we know about that?
Well, that's very interesting because I wondered the same thing myself. And you know, I talked to her daily during part of Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership. I don't know. I never heard her say anything one way or the other. I do know that at least one objectivist who lived in London thought that Thatcher was a big compromiser. But when you listen to her, you know, from the historical viewpoint, what gets through is incredible strength. And it's hard not to admire her from at least a distance. So I don't know if, you know, maybe she was like Reagan in that Reagan said a lot of great things, but did very little. And much of what he did was in the opposite direction of what he said, like raising spending instead of lowering it. But I don't know.
I think an important distinction here is that Ayn Rand was not saying that a woman couldn't be competent at the job. She's saying it would be psychologically unhappy for her. She's not saying that, for example, a Margaret Thatcher wouldn't be better than her alternative, for example. And gosh, if I had a Margaret Thatcher to vote for here on the presidential vote, I would vote for her, even if I thought, gee, I'm causing her psychological misery. And I'm not leaving that question aside. It's not a question of the woman's competence. And I think Ayn Rand makes that pretty clear in her article.
Yeah, she says that.
It's a question of their own internal happiness. And she's using her own psychology as the standard. I'd be miserable if I didn't have a man, at least some man, to look up to, higher than me.
Yeah, and when Frank died, she was miserable until she found a man to look up to. And she had an infatuation, a crush, I guess you would call it, on an actor named Hans Gudegast. And you can look him up. He's a German immigrant to America, and he was a very terrific actor and a very Francisco-like personality. Well, a little grimmer than Francisco. Unfortunately, in the Rat Patrol, which was the show that she watched with him on it, he played a Nazi. Well, no, that's not true. He played a German Wehrmacht army officer. He was not a Nazi, actually. I think they made a point of that. But he was on the wrong side. But Ayn Rand said she liked the premise of friendly enemies. And that's what he and the American, played by Christopher George, who you probably don't know, were. They were friendly. They respected each other. And it was the Desert War, and it's a kind of good series. She watched every episode, and she said when she thought of this guy could play Francisco, it was like the sun came out for the first time since Frank's death, which had been almost a year earlier. So she needed a man to look up to. And fortunately, she was aware that he might not be what he played on the screen. But she found this guy to admire and hero worship. And she was going to cast him if she produced Atlas in the role of Francisco.
Yeah, and he sure looked the part. I'd like to add something. A lot of nasty critics of Ayn Rand will say, well, wait a minute, Frank O'Connor, how could Ayn Rand, this genius, philosophical and literary genius, hero worship this guy who wasn't Hank Rearden in terms of running, inventing Rearden steel or metal or something, or running Rearden steel. Why could Ayn Rand worship this artist, this actor, Frank O'Connor. Ayn Rand explains it very well, and perhaps best in her introduction to the 25th anniversary edition to The Fountainhead. She herself was psychologically about to abandon writing The Fountainhead, she reports. And it was Frank O'Connor who kept her up all night in a conversation, convincing, now imagine this, convincing Ayn Rand of something. He convinced Ayn Rand that she could not give up the world to these detestable people and that she had to go on. He played Howard Rourke to her Dominique.
Yeah.
In other words, it was his confidence, his sense of life, his psychology that she so admired. It might not be his existential achievement as a baron of industry or something, but it was this unique psychology that Frank O'Connor had that she so admired and looked up to and really wanted to have more of herself, which I find very interesting.
I can add, that's a good point. And I can add to that. She wrote her sister when they rediscovered each other in the 70s, and she thought her sister was the same person she knew from their childhood, but the sister wasn't. But that's a later story. But she wrote her sister about who the man was she had married, Frank O'Connor. And she said, "He's my Rock of Gibraltar. He's more uncompromising than I am." He was really a strong man, and I'm remembering so many stories, and some of them are going out of my mind while I'm thinking of the other. Oh yeah, two more. At one point, we were talking about something, and I was doing the Objectivist Forum, which was a magazine, and she was crediting Frank O'Connor with something, and she said, someday I'll write an article for you for the Objectivist Forum, My Debt to Frank O'Connor.
Oh, wow, well, that would have been
wouldn't that have been fabulous?
Oh,
and
man.
about 3 months or 4 months later, when my perennial search for what the hell can I get to publish, was acute. I asked her, I said, you promised that you would write My Debt to Frank O'Connor. And she said, yes. And if you really want to torture me, you'll hold me to that promise. Because it would have been torture to relive, having lost him when he died, it would have been torture for her. So I obviously didn't hold her to that promise. The other is her cook, Eloise. During the period when she was all excited about Hans Gudegast, asked her, suppose in heaven you meet both Frank and Hans Gudegast, which one would you choose? And she told me about Eloise having asked that, and she said, I was indignant, or I was astonished. Of course, Frank. So she always held Frank to be, when she wrote Anthem, I think was it We the Living? Yeah, We the Living was published first, then Anthem. Yeah. I've seen her copy of We the Living and Anthem, and the dedication or the inscription on the inside is, my first temple to you, Frank. And the second one, Anthem, was my second temple to you. So she thought the world of him. She did look up to him. And when he died, she was very, you wouldn't notice it. It's like a mutual friend said, she's like a spread of ashes. To me, she seemed like a roaring fire. But compared to the passion before that, which I didn't know that well, she was a subdued when Frank died. And only when she discovered Hans did she come out of that gloom He was very strong, very important in her life. And my favorite painting is one of his paintings. I have it hanging on my wall. In fact, I can put it up here. You may not like it because it's a sense of life issue, not a technical skill issue. Let's see if I can do that for those who are. Modern technology is wonderful.
So,
but I don't.
I might just add as we're waiting here. Ayn Rand actually said in one of her last interviews, she was asked about her atheism, and after Frank's death, don't you wish that there could be an afterlife where you might meet him? And she immediately said Frank was more of an atheist than she was.
Yeah.
And that if she thought that for a second, she'd kill herself immediately so she could be with him. So he was a major part of her emotional fuel. No question about it. And I think that it's true that in a sense, all her heroes are really projections of Frank's psychology.
Here's, if you see my background, both of those are by Frank O'Connor. Neither one is complete. They're both studies in the process. But when he died, Leonard Peikoff let me pick paintings that other people had not already taken, because Frank O'Connor had, 40 canvases in his apartment that he was in various stages of working on. And the one with the newspaper on the table is my favorite painting of all paintings. That is really my sense of life. That's a lemon on a rope. Why is it a lemon on a rope? Because this painting was assigned by Cappelletti to Frank. Cappelletti's, you probably know, a painter that Ayn Rand, a Spanish painter that Ayn Rand discovered the work of, and they developed a friendship. And he helped Frank with his painting, and he gave him this assignment. And it has a special value to me because the first time I was in Ayn Rand's apartment, this was on the wall, and I looked at it and I said, oh. And she happened to hear me say that, and she said, what? And I said, it's very three-dimensional. And she said, thank you. That was the assignment, which I thought was interesting, that she was thanking, for Frank's achievement. She was taking the compliment as towards her. The other one is also studio, I think at the Art Students League, or no, I guess not, which I think is a really eloquent expression, if you could see it in reality. Tremendous sorrow of this graceful, beautiful female. And you wonder, how is it, she's, to me, she's crying into her hands there, grieving over something. And how on earth does he communicate that when you can't see any of her expression? I don't know the answer, but if you look at the hand that's below the other hand, you can see it's not finished yet. You can see it's only sketched in as a ghostly kind of thing. The other one is further along, but Marianne Sears told me he would have put highlights in the wine on the wine glass, and a few other things would have been done. Anyway, that's a long excursion into Frank O'Connor.
But a worthy one. It does tell us something about her
relationship. A question going back to Ayn Rand's.
Gloria, cutting in and out.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sometimes.
Sorry. Maybe can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if it's nice.
If you kill your video.
Is that better?
Yeah. But it's not a clarity issue. It's that everything freezes. I think if you go audio only for a while, it will give you more bandwidth.
Okay. Maybe, yes. So one question that I have regarding this worship of Ayn Rand with Frank O'Connor, I can see parallelisms with Margaret Thatcher and her husband Dennis. And why would she, even when she was prime minister and she was about to quit, because all the men in her cabinet that that she got rid of in the first place, and then replaced them with people that wouldn't compromise as much. Her support system was Dennis. And sometimes these powerful women, also in the chat, people talking about Indira Gandhi and strong women who find in their husbands that pillar of worship. So why would it be different for a female president than, say, someone that is running a company? Why would that psychological misery would come into place? And I find in the Ayn Rand lexicon on femininity that it ends up summarizing, can a woman have this hero worship and simultaneously lead at the same time? And it says absolutely not. The two contradict. Of course, whether you believe that hero worship is a good thing or not is up to you in objectivism. And never has Ayn Rand said that no one can ever come up with a better philosophy than hers, but that is the best of what we have so far. So does really that hero worship role cannot exist even if you are a female president, considering, for example, the example of Margaret Thatcher and Dennis?
Well, that's why I came on this show to answer that question, because that gets to my point 3. If hero worship is the essence of femininity, does being president go against that? And I think you have to separate that question, because it's possible to answer, no, it doesn't really go against it. But you get the principle if you think of a sovereign, an absolute monarch like Queen Elizabeth I, who has power of life and death over everyone, man, woman, child, dog, that she can say off with their heads and the heads roll. And probably Catherine the Great was that way too. I'm not that familiar with Russian history, but I assume that she had that kind of power.
Even worse.
Yeah. So if you picture this woman who is in charge of everything with the power of life and death over everyone, then ask yourself, is that something that a feminine woman would enjoy? Is that consistent with the desire for looking up to a man, or even having a good sexual relationship? I think the answer is no. And Elizabeth, who was called the Virgin Queen, had a lover who was Essex, I think Duke of Essex, Earl of Essex, and there was a problem. How could he perform? How could he be a lover when if she got angry at him, could have him killed? And to protect against that problem, she took off her ring and gave it to Essex and said, if ever I turn against you and want to, kill you or imprison you or something, send me this ring. This ring is my token to you that however I feel at that time, I will not do it, that you are safe. And I think she had to do that in order to have any kind of relationship. Now, the interesting twist is that she did turn against Essex some years later. She did send soldiers to arrest him. He tried to send her the ring, but something went wrong with the messenger, just like in Romeo and Juliet. And she did not get the ring in time, and apparently had forgotten about it, which is kind of strange, but that's the way the story is. He was sent to the Tower of London, and I think he was killed.
He was executed. He was executed. And it's hard to believe the ring story because I think it's a wonderful example too of a woman in top leadership role who also very much loved men and wanted to look up to men, in my view. And she, the Earl of Leicester, her first longtime boyfriend, she had to set, they never could have a comfortable relationship because she couldn't surrender power either psychologically or actually in a secure way. And that was always the thing that thwarted their romance. There were political reasons when his own wife died why they couldn't get married, but she made the political decision, we can't get married. And so she put the office ahead of being a wife and subordinate, as if she had to make the choice. I'm either going to be the queen in charge, or I can be a wife and a mother and love the man I want to love. And it presented to her as a choice that way. And I think she even knew that she was choosing the path that would be less happy for her. She sacrificed personal, she explicitly, in her own mind, sacrificed personal happiness to be an effective queen and to judge even the men that she fell in love with. So the ring story may be a romantic one because it's just another aspect of how, at least in her own personal life, the difference between having a personal relationship with a man and being queen were simply irreconcilable for her.
Whereas for a king and his loves among women, it's not a problem. I mean, they might be scared, but it wouldn't interfere with his pleasure. Let's put it that way. It's not the same kind. It's not symmetrical. And I think so. If you accept this thought experiment, would there be a problem with remaining feminine or going against it if you were an absolute monarch leading men into battle and being able to cut off their heads? If you say, yeah, well, that's not a feminine role, then the discussion, then you've gotten Ayn Rand's point, and the discussion is, well, how much power does the president of the United States really have? And incidentally, a prime minister in a parliamentary system does not have the same role that the president of a constitutional republic like ours has. The prime minister, just a number one minister, and is not in control of everything. The president is the executive commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And but anyway, you could say, no, I think she exaggerated the situation with the American president. It wouldn't be that role like a sovereign monarch. That doesn't matter. If you agree that the sovereign monarch a woman wouldn't want to be a sovereign monarch, then you've got her point. So that's what I wanted to say, because I think I can reach some of you who might be inclined not to agree with her, to agree with her if you just change the example.
Right. You know, I think that there might be something to what Ayn Rand says about a woman's internal psychology. It would not, I would just make clear again, I don't think it would decide my vote if I had like a Margaret Thatcher to vote for. It wouldn't be her misery that I would be thinking of. It would be it would be the role she's running for versus her competitors and the effect on the country and the world. Right?
I agree with you.
But if my own experience with the love of my life, my soulmate, is any indication, I know that she, as strong and intelligent and as powerful as she is, and she is my equal in all of those ways, if not my superior, there's still a unique pleasure that she gets from leaning on me, from looking up to me. And I never want to disappoint her in that regard. And that's a special pleasure I get as a man. And I think there's something to that, something that is real. You know, Ayn Rand trusted her psychology. She trusted her own emotions. Yes, she thought, I think Harry's right. She wouldn't write an essay if she didn't think it through. She didn't say things off the cuff. Her opinions expressed opinions were never thoughtless, ever. And if she wrote something out, she could be really clear. And in this case, I think she was onto something, even if I don't quite fully understand it myself. I'll put it that way.
Well, we can't introspect.
We have
Go ahead.
We have another super chat question, and it's from Marvin K. He asks, what's the difference between the ideal man and the ideal woman in a work of art? How could this differ from, for example, a marble sculpture compared to a novel?
I don't get the last part. How does it, the marble statue part?
Yeah, like how would it differ, the image of an ideal man and an ideal woman from a marble sculpture, from an ideal man or an ideal woman portrayed in a novel, if there would be any difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between sculpture and a novel. And for a novel, we have Ayn Rand's novels is how it would be portrayed. I think also there are other ideal women. It's easier to find ideal men, maybe not. But there is an ideal woman. If you're not familiar with her, I commend her to you. And that's Elizabeth Barrett. Did I get the name right? In Pride and Prejudice. Who's someone, I haven't read it in a long time, but I think it's Elizabeth Barrett, but that sounds a little like Robert Browning and Mrs. Barrett. Does someone there correct me? Or I can't see I have to look on the chat. The chat is.
We also have a raised hand from Adam Reed.
You're muted, Adam.
We have a raised hand.
Yeah, Adam, you should be able to unmute now. But we still can't hear you, even though it looks as if you're unmuted.
Bennett, yes, Elizabeth Bennett. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, Adam, we can't hear you. So do you want to see if you can fix that? And maybe, Gloria, we can go to the other super chat for now.
Yes. I think that, I don't know if we have more questions on the super. Oh, yes. Could you comment on this statement and clarify the psychologically unworthy part? Thank you. And the comment is, for a woman to seek or desire the presidency is in fact so terrible a prospect of spiritual self-immolation that the woman who would seek it is psychologically unworthy of this job.
Unworthy, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Unworthy of this job.
I'm not sure I'd go that far because I have to compare it to the defective male psychology she's running against as well. I mean, I can imagine a worse psychology than that, assuming that's even a problem. I can imagine much worse psychology in her male alternatives. Now, does that make her as such unworthy? I'm not sure I would say that. Now, I think we could separate that, though, from the question, is that less than ideal for a feminine psychology? Is she in a less than ideal? Is she in an unhappy situation? Which I think is the thrust of Ayn Rand's comments. I'm not sure if it would make her unworthy as such to even hold the office. There I would need, I think, the broader context, for example, the male psychology she's running against.
I'd like to say something that is slightly distancing me from Ayn Rand. I usually spend all my energies in putting forward our common view, but here's something that is a little different between me and her, and I think she's, in this regard, not modern. She had this, well, first of all, let's go back to college. She majored in history in college. That's well known, but what you may not know is what part of history she majored in. And it was a medieval era. Now that's the one I would run from. But she liked the idea of aristocrats, knights and kings and queens. And she thought that was glamorous and exciting. And she always said that there were two types of heroes in her novels. One is the aristocratic type, like Francisco or Gail Wynan in The Fountainhead. And the other is, and of course she loved them both, the other was the kind of American direct type, like Rourke and Reardon and Galt. So she thought that all of her novels, in We the Living, Andre is the straight ahead, no nonsense guy, and Leo is the aristocrat who has a certain insouciance and style and so forth that Andre does not have. Incidentally, it's Andrei Taganov. Perhaps like me, you think it's Andrei Taganov, but she pronounced it Andrei Taganov. And it's Kira Argunova, not Kira Argonova. So that may come as news to you. So she had a certain respect for the hierarchical society of Europe and
well, it's interesting that
nobility.
Gail Wynan comes from Hell's Kitchen. It's not he's
a patrician. He's a
patrician with the fine, elegant taste in art and so forth.
Yeah.
So he has the characteristics of an aristocrat, but he doesn't have the background of an aristocrat. He comes from Hell's Kitchen. So what's interesting is that the aristocratic type for her isn't necessarily a lineage.
No, it isn't. And that was why she opposed monarchy as a teenager, not because, well, I shouldn't say not, but aside from the issue of whether someone should have that much power, she objected to the idea that just because you're born from somebody who was a great leader, you would be a great leader. You can't inherit that kind of ability and talent. So it was from that aspect that she was definitely against.
Even as a teenager, she opposed even a constitutional monarchy in Russia. Right, and we have that confirmed too, corroborated.
So she had this. She told me, she shocked me when she said Edward, who was it the fifth, who gave up the throne for Mrs. Simpson?
The eighth, Edward the Eighth.
Edward the Eighth, really? Okay. I didn't know it went to me. Anyway, Edward gave up the throne, as she said, like this, for love. And she thought, and I said, but shouldn't you give it up? I mean, it's a terrible thing. And she was defending that the position of the King of England is a great position, and it should not be lightly tossed aside. Whereas my attitude is it's a terrible position and it should be immediately tossed aside. And if you watch the series on Elizabeth, The Crown, and there's two series now, I think. One of the themes seems to be the terrible dehumanizing effect of being even a constitutional monarch. Yeah. So she had, when she looked at the president, I feel terrible in trying to act superior to Ayn Rand. But let us say the question arose in my mind, whether she was seeing it through the lens of her respect for nobility and aristocracy and gave it more stature and more power than we Americans think of the president as having.
That's very interesting. You know, in Atlas Shrugged, there's a really interesting dynamic about all this. There's that moment when Dagny Taggart says she regrets. There was a moment when she regretted being the descendant of Nathaniel Taggart, right? So she couldn't do it. She wouldn't be able to kind of be independent completely on her own. That's what she really would have wanted. And then, of course, we see her brother, who is equally aristocratic, who is nothing, no quality to him at all. So in Ayn Rand's mind, aristocracy is not a question of birth.
No.
Right? And she has John Galt and Howard Rourke literally coming from nowhere. And I think, so she's an individualist in that sense. I don't think she believed in an inherited aristocracy. But I think you're right. There's something about the aesthetic of nobility that I think appealed to her, and you can see it in her literature.
Yeah, which doesn't to me. They don't come from nowhere. They come from Ohio.
Right. Which is where Frank O'Connor comes from.
Where Frank O'Connor comes from. And she said, all my heroes will always come from Ohio.
That's beautiful.
She said that.
Right.
So,
but you know, with all of her, most of her other main characters, she'll give them mothers and childhoods and developmental explanations for their problems, issues, psychologies. With John Galt and Howard Rourke, there's sort of exceptions to that. And when you read her notes for those novels, that's on purpose. It's almost as though she didn't need some sort of developmental explanation. They're just being rational. I'm not sure how that quite related, but
we have another super chat question from Louise Lamarquan, and she asks, how did Rand define the essence of masculinity? What is the essence of femininity understood as hero worship being contrasted with in the essence?
Well, there was a kind of official answer and an unofficial answer, or let me put it this way. The official answer was that masculinity is strength, but mental strength, psycho-epistemological strength was what she said. Now, of course, the woman has psycho-epistemological strength too. So that's not something that distinguishes man from woman, but that's what masculinity is. And I once asked her, what is masculinity? Expecting her to say psycho-epistemological strength. And she didn't. She said decisiveness, which I think was really interesting, both as a quality and for the fact that she did not go to her theory. She obviously was responding from her own admiration and thinking about, fresh thinking at that on the spot of what is it about the men I admire that makes them manly. And she came up with decisiveness. This was characteristic of her. She did not take her previous theories and concepts and conscious superstructure and bring it down and impose it on reality. She looked at reality afresh, and sometimes she would use a different, slant on something that she had talked about before. Right. That's what always made it interesting.
She trusted her own psychology. And very often, if she's not making a philosophical statement, I think she's telling you about her own psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of another very, very, very important psychological thing I got from her. It doesn't relate to sex roles, but I'm going to pass it on anyway. In the classes on nonfiction writing that she gave to aspiring writers for the Objectivists, and I was present at those. She talked about what she called the squirms, which is sort of like writer's block. It's a little different, but we don't have to worry about that. So difficulties that she had in writing. And she said there were times when she had this squirms, when she felt, why did I ever think I could be a writer? How does one write? I mean, I'm completely paralyzed here. I have no idea what to say, and I can't imagine ever having an idea of what to say. So there's this terrible state, right? And she then said, so I asked myself, what does my mind need that it doesn't have? So rather than what anybody else in the world would say, what is wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Oh God, I'm a failure. I pose as a writer and I can't write. Why can't I write? What's wrong with me? I'm no good. Whatever, thoughts. Not that those would be conscious convictions of anybody, but this kind of emotional vibrations were going. But what she did was she looked at her psycho-epistemology or psychology, the way her mind functioned, as a practical problem. So there's something, the mechanism isn't working now. So let me go in and debug it. Rather than, oh God, I can't do it, I'm no good, which anybody else would do. So rather than saying, what is wrong with me? It was, what does my mind need that I haven't given? And she would always find it. She said sometimes it took days of excruciating effort, but she would eventually uncover a contradiction in the orders that she was giving herself. Meaning, like, Francisco has to, I'm just making this one up, but I think you could relate to it. Francisco has to be gay and carefree, and Francisco's heart is broken because he can't have Dagny for maybe for years and maybe ever. So now write the scene about him and Dagny. Well, you can't because you've got a contradiction, but it wouldn't necessarily be conscious of what the contradiction was, like that crude one that I just gave you. But she would always be able to get a contradiction identified and then be able to write again. What I think is so very, very important is not to make failure or difficulties an issue of your worth or your self-esteem. It's a technical problem if you can't do something. I'm done.
We have to raise hands. Let's see if Adam is ready now. Go ahead.
Are you saying anything, Adam? Because we're not
Yeah,
hearing.
we still can't hear you.
Let me see if we can go to Stephanie then. She also has a raised hand.
Unmute me. Unmute me.
You're unmuted, Stephanie.
Yeah, I can hear you, Steph.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that story, Harry. That was great. About how Ayn Rand debugged her own writer's block. So thank you for that. But that wasn't my question. My question is, why do you think Ayn Rand had respect for nobility?
She saw it as the achievement. Because remember, we're not talking about inherited nobility. We're talking about someone who wins the title, wins the battle. Remember Kira's Viking, if you've read about that. So she saw it as an achievement. And it was, all the literature of the Romantic era was about well, was Hugo? No, Hugo wasn't. But a lot of it was Racine and Moliere, and the French certainly emphasized. It was all about high-born people who acted on a different plane than the regular people. So it was excellence, it was ability,
Yeah,
it was
I
distinction.
I think there's an aesthetic here. In Atlas Shrugged, she actually draws a comparison between corporate logos and coats of arms.
Hmm.
You know, what it is to her is the symbolic recognition of virtue. That is to say, if something is noble, if something is good and worthy of earned, not just inherited, right? If something's an earned nobility, then it deserves that symbolic recognition. It deserves that aesthetic. You know, it's like the lights and the candles at Dagny's debutante ball. Do they think that is what gives them meaning? Or do they give the lights and candles meaning? So I think what Ayn Rand is saying is that the language of nobility, the aesthetics of nobility belong to a different group of people, right? Those who understand it is important. Remember, Dagny says, I don't dismiss the importance of the candlelight and the chandeliers. No, not at all. In fact, that's the appropriate aesthetics if the people are worth it. Makes sense?
Why can't one aristocrat die in the face of the Soviet Socialist Republic?
Wow, yeah.
You know, that was the way she looked at it. The outstanding man versus the masses. And she kept that. Even though officially she, you know, didn't, well, I shouldn't say officially, when it came to doing politics, that had no part in it. So it was an aesthetic issue, you're right. Symbolic issue, yeah.
So when Ayn Rand admires someone or admires something, you know, it's almost as like she is like Queen Elizabeth knighting someone. I dub thee. You know, you almost have that when Ayn Rand admires, she will make a symbol and ritual out of it, and she will make the recognition well known for that reason. It deserves the recognition, the self-conscious assertion afterwards, the coat of arms, the symbol, you know, admire that, put that on a pedestal. I think that's what it means to Ayn Rand. She made value judgments. There were better people. There were worse people. That needs to be recognized. And that could be built in, as far as she's concerned, you know, give the noble people a crown to recognize their virtue. But it's not an inherited one, no.
You remember
but it usually is inherited. I wonder if it had anything to do with her own background and the persecution that the business class that her family belonged to suffered. They were treated like they had inherited rather than had worked for their business, so they were lumped in. So maybe for that reason, she had a sense of kinship with them, even though it wasn't on any other score. I don't know. I'm not making it.
No, I think what James said is right. It was an aesthetic issue of the man of ability versus the mediocrities. I'm thinking about and looking up now the scene at the end, the tunnel disaster. If I can find it.
Oh, in Atlas?
Yeah. Because the last level of hell is the man in bedroom A, car number 14. No, sorry. You see, that's a philosopher. In drawing room B, car number 15 was an heir who had inherited his fortune and who had kept repeating, why should Reardon be the only one permitted to manufacture Reardon metal? No, he's not the last one. It's the man in bedroom A, car number 16, was a humanitarian who said, and this really is the last one, who had said, the men of ability, I do not care what or if they are made to suffer. They must be penalized in order to support the incompetent. Frankly, I do not care whether this is just or not. I take pride in not caring to grant any justice to the able where mercy to the needy is concerned. That is the lowest. That was the lowest. And there you see that in her mind, the aristocrat is the symbol of the man of ability. And in the beginning, it was ability to organize physical force to win battles. That's what got you a title.
You know, in her day, heroes were always given a black eye and feet of clay, and you could never really have a hero in her time, and she objected to that in literature. And so, in her mind, there were heroes, there were villains, there were people who deserved the recognition of being a better person, and the negative recognition of being a worse person. It's that kind of moral judgment that she found was lacking in her age of relativism and moral neutrality, and no heroes are really perfect and no villains are really that awful. No, Ayn Rand had a black and white view, and she thought some people were really, really good and some people were really, really bad, and that needed to be acknowledged in an aesthetic way, in a symbolic way.
Let's see if now we can give voice to Adam one more time. No, I don't know if Adam can hear us. If not, we're gonna go to the chat. We have a lot of questions. Raising about Indira Gandhi. It is interesting that the majority of prophets that have been sent by God to the world have been men, and then the majority of people who follow religion tend to be women. More women attend church than men. Would you use the general public as good examples of something that is preferable in the following and the worshiping? I guess that this examples comes to the point of saying that women as hero worshippers could also be more followers of religion than men.
Well, I wouldn't care to say that, but I'm glad you raised that, or the question raised it, because I do want to attack the politically correct notion that patriarchy is just cultural. There have been no matriarchies ever in history. There couldn't possibly be. Someone objected to when I said that recently, that there have been societies in which women were the only ones to own property because the men were away at war or whatever. But there's never been a society in which women ruled. There couldn't be. Because women biologically, until recently, 100 years ago, well, until the 60s was birth control, but certainly 100 years ago, had to stay at home. So they couldn't be, as a group, allowing for individual exceptions, had to be in the background compared to men. I mean, if you go back far enough, you get to the tribal savage where the woman is pounding the corn to make cornmeal, and the man is out there with his bow and arrow, and it has to be that way. Now, it doesn't have to continue to be that way. Now we've got technology, and now muscles and energy levels do not determine success even in war. So it doesn't have to go on being there. But I find it so obnoxious when feminists pretend that the patriarchal domination of history had exceptions, or that it was unnatural, or that it was something that was imposed from some outside power and shouldn't have been. Now, you can well argue that, now it should not be, and I would support that. But don't make an argument from false history.
Yeah, the division of labor between men and women that occurred before modern technology was not imposed by men, but was imposed by nature.
Yeah.
Women are the ones who get pregnant. Women are the ones who nurse. There's a natural connection between pregnancy and early childcare and women. And that division of labor, where taking care of the children was the infants, but earlier on in age especially, women were the natural caregivers. They were the ones who got pregnant. The fact that men were the ones doing most of the other stuff is simply a question of biology. It's not a question of men coming along and oppressing women.
Yeah.
I'm not denying that there wasn't irrational discrimination against women or even men maybe sometimes, but that's not the point here. The point here is that the basic division of labor that is governed most of history, where men are the ones out there doing most of the stuff, being the prophets, if you will, but also being the scientists, political leaders, what else? Because they're not the ones who are pregnant and nursing and taking care of babies. And if you think about it, during a healthy woman's, normal cycle of being fertile, most of her adult life will be taken up with the possibility, if she's sexually active, of having babies in the old days, right? And it is these technological changes that make muscles less important, and very significantly, birth control, unsafe abortion, that sort of liberate women from they now have more of a choice. But it wasn't. It was technology that gave them that choice.
Yeah, very recent. Yeah, very well said. I agree entirely. It's like a variant of the noble savage myth.
Right.
That these horrible Europeans came in and took these wise, beautiful, sage Indians who lived in harmony with their natural environment and willfully slaughtered them. It's a complete opposite of the truth.
Right. Total nonsense. So yeah, this notion.
We have another.
I was just going to add, this notion of contemporary feminism is just that patriarchy. Men are in effect have been oppressing women forever, and patriarchy is the enemy. That's again mythology, just wrong.
We have another question, super chat from Normative Randroid, really cool name. He asks, did Rand ever comment on the Tsar during his early years, his character, his reign, or his nobility?
No, first of all, she was 12 when the Tsar, when the revolution came. So this is an interesting sidelight in terms of how things have changed. Ayn Rand, as we had said, was rebellious or unconventional and challenging when she made Dagny a woman effectively running the railroad. But even a woman executive, is very. If you saw them in movies, they were always criticized for being women executives. But in her childhood, when she was around 12, 13, began thinking about things philosophically, she read newspapers in St. Petersburg and in the Ukraine. I think it's in St. Petersburg that the story primarily concerned. Her parents didn't let her do that. She had to sneak it. Can you believe that? It was considered unfeminine for a woman to read a newspaper. And she and her cousin, Nina, would secretly read newspapers and have political opinions. That the Victorian ethics of the time did not want young ladies to be reading newspapers. So it's a very different world that is hard for us to grasp. It's easier for me because I'm closer to that time. I remember when growing up, a woman would not smoke on the street. that was considered you were a floozy if you smoked while you were outside. In fact, a woman basically didn't smoke. Women weren't. It was just changing that women could smoke. It was considered not an elegant, graceful thing to do. And now it's back to that, but in a different
there was a
way.
wonderful commercial for Virginia Slims in the old days, right? You've come a long way, baby. It was a woman's cigarette. A woman could smoke in public.
Yeah.
As if that was feminist progress, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Her father was very Victorian. And when he found out she had political views in adolescence, he was scandal. Oh, and this is interesting. She wrote a story, which was kind of the grandfather of Atlas Shrugged, when she was in Russia in her teens. I'm not exactly sure when, but I think older than 12. And the story had the heroine going to the hero who had not, they were not yet realizing they were in love with each other or something. She was trying to get them to go on strike, all the great industrialists of Europe. She was trying to get them to go on strike. And for this guy, she went clothed in a tunic and threw off her tunic and stood before him naked. And I guess offered herself if he would go with her and leave the country to go on strike. And her father read it and was scandalized. And she told me, he said, "How do you know of such things?" Of sex, and they never gave her the facts of life talk. She never got that. She did not know about sex until she and her cousin Nina figured out they could use a dictionary to look up words and then look up other words. And they got it. They figured it out from a dictionary. This was Victorian society. So she was very opposed to that.
Yeah, politics was for the men in the day of Ayn Rand's childhood, for sure. And for her to even enter that was unconventional in itself. The fact that she's talking with her cousin and her friends about what the proper government and reading newspapers or what the proper government in Russia should be is in itself interesting. Yeah. There's the comment I wanted to pick up on earlier about Ayn Rand saying that what she thought of as the essence of masculinity is decisiveness. I was doing a little introspection myself. When I first read Atlas Shrugged, I fell in love with Dagny Taggart. And that wonderful opening scene where she takes charge of the comet when it stopped. And it's her decisiveness that was really struck me. Yeah. Dagny is decisive, in a way that her brother is just, don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me. What? Can't we put it off? Who, right? Who's going to take the blame for him? So he's like, she's taking responsibility. She's being decisive. That's what I fell in love with. On the other hand, I guess from my own perspective I projected in my mind that this is the sort of woman I would want to admire me. It's not that it was the decisiveness I saw as her feminine quality at all, but it did make her, in my mind, as I'm falling in love with this fictional character, the sort of woman I would want to admire me.
What won me over was that same scene. First, she's on the train, right? And every fourth beat of knock of the wheels was accented. And she says, I won't read it because it would take a second. Just for once, it's all right to drop the controls and just feel. And I thought, wow, she's got mental control. She runs her mind. That's great. I've never heard it, that expressed before. And then a little later in that scene, when she wakes up and the train has stopped and she gets off and she's talking to the conductor and whatever, he mentions a red light ahead. That's why they're not moving. There's a red light ahead. and a passenger says, "Red light means danger, lady." And I thought that was hysterically funny, because here's the one we knew by that time ran the railroad. And a passenger is instructing her, "Let me explain it to you. See, that red light means this. We can't go on. We can't go on." I thought that was very funny and very, not tongue-in-cheek exactly, but our author's nudge to you with the elbow, and I like that.
So it's not that decisiveness as a essential masculine quality is absent in her heroines, quite the opposite.
Yeah.
It's just the effect of that to the psychology of sex on men and women.
Yeah, it's like that isn't what you would respond to. I mean, no, I don't respond to decisiveness in women. But maybe that's because I'm an intellectual who never decides anything anyway.
Well,
we are 10 minutes, 8 minutes actually to finish our live, but we are you're welcome to stay in the Zoom after the live stream is finished. But before we finish, I have a question for both of you gentlemen, and maybe after that we can hear your conclusions on what would be the proper take if someone asks, what was Ayn Rand's take on a woman being president? Like, what would be to such a be immoral for an objectivist to give guidance to a woman that wants to run for a political career? And the reason why I asked this question is because 2 years ago, I launched my presidential campaign in Guatemala. Of course, it was illegal because I don't have the age, and you have to have a political party. Independent candidatures are and when Jaron Brook was here in Mexico and we met while he was giving conferences, he publicly said that he would gladly be an advisor for my campaign. And we were joking about that, and it comes to my mind, what would happen on a campaign would be advised by an objectivist professor? Would that be immoral or not?
I think if he knew that he was making someone unhappy, right? I presume that. See, if I was to give someone advice to be do something, what's the advice I'm giving them? The personal advice. I don't think you share this aspect of Ayn Rand psychology in that respect. I'm not sure, in other words, that you'd be miserable. So if I was giving you advice qua Gloria, it would be different than my advice, because you've got to be the best candidate for president of Guatemala. So in that context, no, of course, there's nothing immoral with doing that. There would be something if I thought that you, Gloria, would be psychological. Remember, that's the limited context that Ayn Rand's talking about here. She's not saying you couldn't be the best. She's not saying you'd be the best alternative in this context even. What she's saying is that it would make a woman miserable. And if I thought I was making you miserable, Gloria, yeah, it would be immoral for me to suggest you to do that. You should be selfish. But if my advice is as a political advisor, and I'm pretty sure you're the best candidate for president of Guatemala, I would happily join in. And if I didn't think I was making you miserable, there'd be no moral issue at all, would there?
Yeah, I agree, James. And she never says it's immoral. She says, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't like it. It would go against my sense of myself as a woman. And I can't, in effect, in parenthesis, and I can't understand how any woman could want it. But if a woman does want it and is not miserable, and why shouldn't she?
Right.
You know, if it's a different context now, and maybe you don't agree, you don't think it's going to make you miserable, maybe you get in office and find it doesn't. And then it would be a wonderful thing.
at this point, Harry and James, I believe that it makes everybody miserable. I don't think I don't think it's a matter of gender. Actually, there are a lot of studies on how people age if they become president, like how their health is always damaged and all of that. And it's interesting because regardless of the gender, it's a matter of understanding how leadership is in crisis and how we govern ourselves.
I think that all those traditional arguments that have been made
needs
that women
to go through transformations.
Right. I think that all those traditional arguments, women are too emotional, they can't be rational, those kind of things, Ayn Rand would have dismissed out of hand, and I don't think apply.
She did. She did.
So,
she does in the article. Ludwig von Mises, to take what you're saying, Gloria, von Mises would ask, what is the first thing you would do if you were president? And he said, resign.
yes.
So, it's a horrible, horrible position. But I won't say if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. I'm not saying that. I'm just kind of playing hard to get.
Right. Well, James and Harry, thank you very much for all your ideas expressed here. I think that we have had a wonderful time, and we're gonna end the live stream, but if you wanna stay on the Zoom, you're welcome to. And to remind you that the Ayn Rand Center UK is holding interesting conversations every Monday, as well as other events. So for your final conclusions, maybe some what would direct a woman being president or prime minister? Thank you.
Gloria, you kind of broke off there at the end, but I did like the fact that we ended this event with people who agree with the essence of Rand's article on this, still saying, yeah, we will all get behind Gloria's campaign for president, and
right.
Open.
No, really. Feel free to call me for advice, Gloria. Really, I'm happy to.
Gloria, don't call unless there's an ambassadorship for me in it.
Okay. But I would have to move the embassy. I would have to move the embassy from Washington, D.C. to Florida. I think I can convince people of that. Thank you.
Where did you want to move it to?
To Florida, so you don't have
to
Florida.
Sunny
Florida. Right.
Yeah. That's great. Anywhere but Washington D.C. You know, could be New York, or not San Francisco either. Yeah. But I'll take any other city.
And let me just say we're kind of staying on a similar theme this week. Wednesday's essay discussion with James Valliant will be on Rand's essay Through Your Most Grievous Fault, which she wrote about shortly after Marilyn Monroe passed away.
I love that.
Was a newspaper article originally. And on Thursday, on The Selfish Lovers, Gloria and Nikos are joined by Dr. Andrew Bernstein to discuss gender dynamics in Rand's fiction. So we're very much staying on the theme.
We're on a theme here, yeah.
And Friday is the last episode of the Psychology of the Fountainhead Characters. It's once again we'll be discussing, or the panelists will be discussing Howard Rourke. So if you enjoyed that series, it concludes this Friday, and then next Friday we will already start our next series, The Psychology of Atlas Shrugged Characters. That's going to be a much longer series. And next Monday, we will have an event with the three hosts of that show, Andrew Bernstein, Shoshana Milgram, and Ellen Kenner. So I hope you'll join us for that. And thanks again. Massive thank you to our speakers and to our chair tonight. And see you again very soon.
See you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, the stream should be